The illusion of choice is one of the most heavily debated topics in the video gaming spectrum of recent years. A question of intent versus player choice that has all but exploded in popularity, prompted by releases like Life is Strange, Mass Effect and Bioshock. It is a fascinating and oftentimes polarising theory that inspires an intriguing question. To what extent does player choice matter in a narrative-driven game? And where do we draw the line between author intent and the effect of player agency upon a usually carefully crafted world? We can argue the semantics all day over whether or not choice in games is always an illusion, but that's an argument that's largely irrelevant to the discussion that I want to have. I don't want to spend too long reiterating the same point in 30 different ways, so let me leap straight into the fray that I've lined up for you today. To begin with, let's break down the effects of player choice into 3 specific branches. Games where player choices don't affect the narrative at all, for example, choosing to play non-lethally in a Metal Gear game. Games where choice affects the immediate narrative but not the ending, such as The Walking Dead Season 1 or Life is Strange. Or vice versa, such as Far Cry 3 and the Souls series. And games where choice affects all aspects of the narrative, including the ending, such as Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill Shattered Memories. It's the second branch that I want to focus on today, but before I delve into the game I really desperately want to talk about, let's take a little time to discuss the alternatives first. After all, you can't appreciate a fine wine if you don't taste some naff ones first, right? The least impactful of the options is the first branch, games where the narrative is either very, very mildly affected or just not affected at all by a player's choice. The example I gave is a prime one. Electing not to kill any enemies in Metal Gear Solid games won't affect the larger narrative, but it will give you a better rating at the end of the game, or missions in the case of Phantom Pain. The vast majority of games fall into this category. Call of Duty doesn't care how you win, as long as you win. Bioshock Infinite couldn't give a flying squirrel whether you choose the bird or the cage. Gears of War, Bayonetta, Resident Evil 5 and 6. I'd be here forever if I tried to list everything that falls into this category. If a game has a win state that doesn't change regardless of how you play it, it falls under this enormous umbrella. And that's not a bad thing. Not every game needs to inspire philosophical debate on the nature of life and existence. Not every game needs to sound bold and brave, enthralling or rich. Some games are just meant to be sheer light-hearted fun, and sometimes that is all you need. But other times, a game can be extremely linear, with the most uninspired by-the-books gameplay, and still tell a truly outstanding story.
Fucking touch me!
It's okay, it's me! It's me! It's me! Look! It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
No.
It's okay.
What matters isn't your choices, but rather the way you're carried through the game, and the impact it leaves on you, if any at all. The second category is not even half as broad as its predecessor, but it is the larger of the 2 choice-affected umbrellas. Games whose immediate narratives are affected but still favour a linearly scripted ending, or alternatively, games whose narratives are not affected but present the player with a choice typically informed by prior events, are much more commonplace and growing more frequent year upon year. These games, with their need to tell a story but still afford the player a greater degree of agency, seem to be among the more polarising experiences in the gaming community as of late, partly down to the rise in walking simulators, and partly down to the fact that everyone and their grandmother seems to be trying their hand at a game that screams your actions will have consequences in your face every time you innocently choose a dialogue option. Let's take 2 of the more egregious examples in recent memory. Life is Strange and Beyond Two Souls, starting with the latter. David Cage has become something of a humorous figurehead when it comes to emotional games, with parodies and memes rife across the internet, but there was a time when his games were at least semi-decent and enjoyable despite their over-exaggeration and emotions. Games like Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain handled player choice with wildly varying degrees of success, and both were indicative of the potential hidden within choice-driven gameplay. Fahrenheit suffered from a tremendously mediocre second half, and Heavy Rain lost its charm when you realised that whilst there were somewhere around 32 endings or something like that, the killer never changed, and knowing the twist made the game feel tedious no matter what choices you made. Games where the final sequence is naturally affected by your prior choices are extremely rare, but they do exist. Mass Effect 2 is a stellar example of gameplay organically informing how the ending plays out. Did you earn your crewmates' loyalty? How did you resolve an argument between two characters? Did you upgrade your ship's shields and cannons? If you didn't, you're in for a bumpy ride. But back to the matter at hand. Beyond Two Souls is a game that cares so little for player interaction that you barely even need to play it at all. It is impossible to die in this game unless the game expressly wants you to. If you deliberately ignore or even contemplatively linger on a dialogue choice or decision for too long, the game will make the choice for you. Miss that attack in a fight? Not to worry. Ellen Page can handle herself just fine, thank you very much. Not sure what to say? Don't sweat it, she'll pick something for you. Beyond is a game that so desperately wants to be a movie that no matter how hard you try, the only remedy to stop it from doing what it wants is to turn the bloody thing off. Aside from being nonsensical, messy, chaotic, disordered, boring, slow, tedious, dull, dreary, and utterly absurd, Beyond Two Souls is probably the least interactive video game I have ever played, and I recently made a video about walking simulators. Life is Strange was 90% fantastic and 10% what the hell. The way your choices organically affected the immediate narrative was genuinely interesting, curious, and often emotional. Its ability to harken back to something that seemed at the time so insignificant was, for the most part, remarkable. If you didn't poke around a certain character's bedroom enough in the early part of the game, you wouldn't be able to save their life later on unless you were extremely lucky with your choices. If you chose to warn a certain other character one too many times throughout the game, they wouldn't let you save them in the final episode because they were terrified of all the horrific things that always seemed to happen around you, ultimately leading to their death. And then the game buggered it all up by reducing your hours of careful narrative sculpting to a binary choice. It was an enormous waste of potential, and to many it made the game feel like an enormous waste of time. It's like a half and half narrative. The developers want you to make choices to feel as though you have full agency over the game and its world, but at the same time the game has a story it wants to tell, and woe betide you should you try to get in its way. That isn't an issue in and of itself. There are plenty of games that juggle this duality well. Grand Theft Auto is one of the more obvious choices here, as the gameplay and narrative inform one another quite well. You aren't being made to drive around like a lunatic, mow down helpless civilians, or beat the living bejesus out of the police until a helicopter blasts you to smithereens, but the game gives you the means and the freedom to do so, if you want to. It becomes an issue when the gameplay and the narrative are at extreme odds, like the ending to Mass Effect 3, for example, or the complete lack of an ending, or anything, really, to Andromeda. So, what happens on the rare occasion that you get a game that balances narrative, gameplay, and player choice almost perfectly? Well, you end up with one of the greatest games of all time. To clear things up and get my obvious bias out of the way first, this is my favourite video game ever made. It was the first PC game I ever played, the first non-Nintendo game I'd ever set eyes upon. I was 8 years old when I played it for the first time, and my tiny, console-addled child mind was completely blown. It was the most expansive, intriguing, and exciting video game I had ever played, and to a degree, it still is. It's said that every time you mention Deus Ex, somebody reinstalls it. I know that's been true of me in the past, so to resolve the issue, this barely 1GB game is permanently installed on my PC. Problem solved. Every time I replay Deus Ex, I'm struck by its ingenuity. There are innumerable tiny details in this game, details I still pick up on 17 years later. There are aspects of Deus Ex that both impress and amuse me every time I play it. Tiny little things, like the fact that electing not to give a hotel owner a gun at one point in the story completely changes an encounter several hours later, or choosing to poke around in a cemetery groundskeeper's lodgings reveal a bizarre electronic contraption and turn the keeper hostile. Or the fact that nosing around in the ladies' toilets in the UNATCO offices will cause the chief to dock your pay for your next or most recent mission. Or the unfinished fragments of the novel Jacob's Shadow written by one of the game's developers, which, despite being positively minuscule, is genuinely enthralling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For those of you who don't know much or anything about this game, let me give you some background information. Deus Ex is a cyberpunk FPS/RPG hybrid developed by Ion Storm and published by Eidos Interactive, or Eidos depending on how you want to say it. Released on the PC way back in 2000 and on the PS2 in 2002, it explores themes of conspiracy theory, domestic terrorism, and transhumanism from the point of view of cybernetically enhanced military cadet JC Denton. JC is what is sometimes pejoratively known in this alternate history world as an Aug, an augmented human being infused with nanotech, which typically grants extraordinary gifts and abilities. As part of this nanotech infusion, JC persistently sports a pair of sunglasses to hide his augmented vision, and communicates with his superiors and peers through the infolink, an audio implant in his cranium that is inaudible to everyone else. The game emphasises player choice within both its story and its gameplay elements, with the latter providing a multitude of ways to complete an objective. Let's take an early sequence in Battery Park. You're warned of a terrorist attack at the nearby subway. Civilians have been taken hostage and explosives have been set up. There's an alarm system in place that, if triggered, will detonate the explosives. There's a front entrance guarded by 3 troops, or a vent in one of the nearby buildings that will take you straight onto the platform. A wrong move or misplaced bullet could trigger the explosives. How do you proceed? What you choose to do in this scenario has only minor ramifications in the grand scheme of things. Failing to save the hostages, or deliberately sacrificing them, will cause your pay to be docked when you return to headquarters and lower your colleagues' opinions of you for what difference that makes. But it is a simple, effective early game method of setting up the less obvious choices that the game unveils along the way. Simple and effective, 2 invariably intertwined phenomena that many modern games fail to adequately weave. Let me return to the point I brought up at the start of this discussion. The illusion of choice is one of the most heavily debated topics in video gaming. Ignoring the semantic argument that all choices in games are an illusion, let me put forward the rare diamond in the rough, the game that made your choices matter. That's not to say that every tiny decision you make has consequences. Electing to go right instead of straight ahead on Liberty Island in the game's opening level will only affect the sightseeing tour that you embark on and the conversations you can overhear between terrorists. But there are still basic decisions that can have unforeseen immediate consequences. Did you kill all of the terrorists? Did you only kill some? If you killed them, did you loot their bodies? If you didn't kill them, or didn't loot their corpses, when you make your way back across the island to the UNATCO headquarters, you'll find that all of the terrorists are now dead, and any supplies they had on them have been turned over to the company's quartermaster. Simple, but effective. Did you rescue your augmented comrade, Gunther Hermann, the brutish beast of a man locked inside the Statue of Liberty by the terrorists? If you did you give him a gun? If you chose to give Gunther a gun when you saved him, he will sing your praises to his friend and comrade Anna Navarra. If you saved him but did not give him a gun, he will complain that you were needlessly cruel and will lower her opinion of you prior to working with her in the next mission. If you didn't find him, or chose not to save him at all, your pay will be docked and he will essentially suggest that you are an ineffective bumbling idiot. Simple, with no real lasting consequences, but effective. Deus Ex was not the first game to invest in player choice, or to make use of small but significant alterations in gameplay and story depending on your choices. One of the biggest influences on the game was the original System Shock, released back in 1994, a cyberpunk masterpiece frequently touted as one of the most influential video games of all time. System Shock's producer, Warren Spector, would ultimately go on to become the producer and director of Deus Ex. What Deus Ex does better than any game I've ever played is make all potential approaches viable. Liberty Island is a stellar example of this, but let me give an example that is not the first area of the game before anyone accuses me of only playing the demo, back when demos were entire levels instead of just 20-minute timers. Let's talk about the first mission of Battery Park. When you arrive in Battery Park after putting a swift end to the Liberty Island attack, you are informed of a terrorist situation in the old destroyed Castle Clinton. Several members of the terrorist organisation, the NSF, have retreated into the castle. It's said that there is an extremely valuable canister of a product called ambrosia, we'll get to that later, buried beneath the castle, and it is your job to infiltrate the area, secure the canister, and dispose of the terrorists. You can enter the area in one of 2 sensible ways. Go in through the front entrance, guns blazing, and find the hatch that will take you to the canister, or you can go in through the back way. The back entrance is one of the simplest but easily most brilliant moments of game design in Deus Ex. It is extremely easy to miss, as when you alight upon the island for the first time, you're actually standing right next to it. Here you can uncover an innocuous little keypad, and you can then either use a multi-tool to unlock it, or you can use your head to save some resources. There's a little boy nearby, maybe he saw something. Have a chat with the kid, and for the measly cost of a chocolate bar or a bag of crisps, he will tell you the keypad code. The nearby vending machine will slide back to reveal the secret entrance to the castle, allowing you to get the jump on your enemies. How you choose to handle your enemies has a knock-on effect on the way that Anna Navarro reacts to you once you've completed your objective. Kill everyone in your way and she'll express her pleasure and reward you with extra resources, EMP grenades. Pussyfoot about and you'll piss her off, losing your bonus, your reward, and significantly altering the post-mission dialogue that occurs when you return to the UNATCO HQ. The game is packed to the brim with cause and effect, consequences huge and small, and its opening few missions serve to set the stage for the grander play that is about to go into motion. If any of what I've said has intrigued you and you have genuinely never played this game, I urge you to go and pick it up before you finish this video. It is ludicrously cheap at this point and regularly goes on sale on both Steam and GOG, so do yourself a favour and give it a shot. From this point on, there will be spoilers for the entire game. Deus Ex takes place in an alternate history timeline where many major conspiracy theories of the real world are in fact true. The Illuminati, Majestic 12, FEMA, Echelon, Area 51. It's all here, packed to bursting with exquisite writing and easily the grandest, most intensely executed world building I have ever had the pleasure of immersing myself in. It's no secret that Deus Ex wasn't much of a looker when it was first released, but what this game and its lumbering Unreal Engine lack in beauty, it more than makes up for in sheer engrossing intensity. There were few games at the time that could match its storytelling prowess, perhaps equalled only by classics like System Shock 2 or Half-Life, but Deus Ex's ability to interweave a frankly absurd number of subplots and still make each and every twist and turn of the overarching narrative feel fresh and intriguing stands head and shoulders over its predecessors, peers, and descendants. It is a game of moral ambiguity, of the grey area between civic duty and government pride, of hatred, manufactured death, and the throttling of cures for the fatal rampant plagues mottling its streets for the sake of lining corporate pockets. It is dystopic cyberpunk in its purest, smartest form. While we're on the subject of the way the game feels, let's talk about the actual gameplay itself. The game's core mechanics can be divided into three subsections: stealth, combat, and augmentations, with the latter informing both combat and stealth. The controls are typical first-person key bindings: control to crouch, space to jump, WASD to move, and mouse to aim and shoot. These are largely unremarkable and barely worth discussing, since they're fairly by the books for first-person shooters of the era and of the present. Regarding the core mechanics, you can use all three either combined or independently of one another to progress through an area and complete several goals. Your main mission and any side missions you may uncover through exploration or conversation. You can choose to search the environment for supplies and sneak into a building, lockpicking the doors or hacking keypads, making use of the game's overly simplistic hacking mechanics, that is, stand in front of something, press a button and wait 5 to 10 seconds for it to pop open of its own accord, to underhandedly and quietly subdue your enemies. There are plenty of hidden paths to find, areas that with a few careful looks in the right direction will reveal the code to the door you don't quite have enough multitools for, and looping shortcuts that will often traverse an entire area and make navigating places and avoiding enemies so much simpler. Or the simple alternative is to use any of the many weapons the game gives you to hack, slash and blast the holy bejesus out of the enemies who stand in your way. This is not necessarily the best tactic though, as whilst the game is not overly populated with enemies and their AI is considerably less intelligent than a block of cheese, they can do incredible amounts of damage if you don't make efforts to dodge and strafe, make use of your environment to subvert your enemies or get the drop on them. The game hands you plenty of tools to kill things with: explosives, rifles, shotguns, pistols, swords, throwing knives, all sorts of overpowered lunacy is at your fingertips. But unless you've invested skill points into each weapon's skill branch, you'll find yourself at a loss in many situations if you decide to whip out a GEP gun and suddenly find yourself reduced to a snail's pace. running and gunning is not always wise in this game. The aforementioned skill trees make up the large part of the RPG element of Deus Ex. Informed by earlier efforts like System Shock 2, Deus Ex has a total of 11 skill trees, each with 4 degrees of mastery: Untrained, Trained, Advanced, and Master. Each time you level up the skills related to weapons, you'll find your accuracy greatly improves, the speed of the targeting reticule minimizing upon your enemies increases, as does your damage. If you focus instead on a stealth-based character, you have computer hacking, electronics, and lockpicking skills to invest in. Furthermore, there is explosives training, environment training that reduces damage from biohazardous gases or other environmental hazards, and the totally, utterly, absolutely useful swimming skill. You won't receive enough skill points throughout the game to level up everything, so careful composing of your core skills is a must. You have enough time at the start of the game to decide on what kind of playstyle suits you, with the Liberty Island acting as a training ground for your player behaviour. Once you've settled on a character, it's best to level up at least one weapon skill. I usually opt for small arms or rifles, as I make liberal use of pistol headshots and the tranquilizer darts, and train yourself in computer hacking. But you don't have to. If you want to brute force your way through the game, you can. All approaches are equally viable. What you choose to do is then largely affirmed by the augmentations you can acquire. There are 10 augmentation slots bound to the F keys from 3 to 12, with your torch already active at the start of the game and permanently bound to F12. When you find or are given an augmentation canister, you tend to be given a choice between 2 or 3 different types of augmentation based on the area of your body that they'll be installed in. For example, you can install either a hand-to-hand combat assistance aug or enable the ability to lift heavy objects. Why you would ever want the former augmentation is well beyond my simple alien comprehension, but there you go. Anyway, once an augmentation is installed, it cannot be changed, so choose wisely. Augmentations can also be upgraded, and there are enough of these upgrades scattered throughout the game to max out at least 3 or 4 augmentations. I tend towards the ballistic shields and the regeneration augmentations. Using both of these in tandem pretty much makes you an invincible badass. Other than that, the game has weapon modifications, body armour, camouflage armour, scramble grenades, gas grenades, batons, stun prods. The customizability is outstanding. The hybridisation of the FPS and RPG elements is extremely well done, with an expertise indicative of the love and devotion that went into crafting this game. But what truly makes Deus Ex shine is its story. JC Denton, you, are a rookie cop assigned to the peacekeeping force of UNATCO, the United Nations Anti-Terrorist Coalition, following in the footsteps of your older brother Paul. To prove your value and abilities in combat, JC is sent into a live-fire situation, a terrorist attack on Liberty Island, where the partially destroyed Statue of Liberty stands gloomily overhead. There is a horrific plague known as the Grey Death running rampant across the country, nigh the entire world, and the only known cure, or at least suppressant, is called ambrosia, an insidiously radioactively neon green liquid transported in enormous canisters. The terrorist leader has commandeered a shipment of this ambrosia, and your task is to find the leader, make him surrender, and recover the first of the canisters. On your way, your superiors would very much appreciate you rescuing Gunther Hermann, one of the old mechanically augmented soldiers. So, alone you go, making use of a helpful tip from a UNATCO informant, or ignoring him entirely if you so desire, choosing your route through stealth, brute force, or smart use of security terminals. Once you reach the top of the statue, where the terrorist leader awaits, your first dialogue choice determines whether he will attack you or discuss his motivations. It is in this conversation that the entire stage is set with one simple phrase.
I'll take it from here. You can't fight ideas with bullets.
Enormous in scope and grand in scale, Deus Ex is quite theatrical with its ability to whisk the player away to all manner of earthly corners. One moment you're in the US, New York, downtown Manhattan. The next you're in Hong Kong, Paris, Vandenberg. The locales and the game's ability to differentiate the areas and their culture and themes through even the simplest of things, namely the musical cues, is outstanding. Here, listen to this piece of music and tell me the first place that pops into your head. Alexander Brandon, the game's composer, created easily one of the best video game soundtracks I have ever heard. Each area, or level if you will, has a distinct tone and feel to it. The multiple layers of stringed instruments, synths, and their dark bass undertones are blended together with expert precision. The game features a dynamic soundtrack shifting from ambient to combat to conversation and back again seamlessly. I wouldn't say the music is ever too distracting either. In fact, it has a tendency to swell when you first enter a new area, preparing you for the journey ahead, before quieting down and returning to the background.
If you need help, talk to one of the receptionists.
Welcome to VersaLife. We make tomorrow look like yesterday. How can I help you?
I'm looking for Mr. Hundley.
He's upstairs.
Musical cues are undoubtedly of huge importance in modern games, and it's easy to take them for granted. You've all experienced it, I imagine. Innocently strolling down a hallway when the music suddenly becomes jumpy and skittish, indicating that you've been spotted and urging you to run for it. Or you've just turned a corner and something terribly spooky has leapt out of the darkness. You've just toiled through hell and high water to find someone you love, and are now standing on the precipice of victory. Haunting, ominous choirs summon great beasts. Harsh, fiery vocals empower you into a feeling of pure badassery. A rising soar of tribal drum beats and simplistic, repeating string motifs suddenly become a soaring, emotionally desperate fight for survival. Music has the power to evoke and excite, provoke and surprise. The variety of instruments in play and the recurring motifs that can be heard, subtly and not so, reminding you of precisely what it is you are striving for, the truth. Returning to the story, after performing a few missions for UNATCO and coming across characters who will play a larger part as the story progresses, you find yourself suddenly overwhelmed by a startling turn of events. Your brother Paul has defected, and you are ordered to infiltrate the private aeroplane of the high-ranking NSF officer responsible for the Ambrosia thefts, Juan Ivanovich Lebedev, and kill him. When you arrive, Paul tries to convince you to talk to Lebedev, to learn what he has told Paul about UNATCO that has spurred his defection. This is one of the earliest choices that has an impact on the way your story pans out. Granted, it's not huge, but it is an impact nonetheless. You have 3 choices. Kill Lebedev, irrespective of whether or not you talk to him. If you choose to talk to him first, Anna Navarro will arrive and order you to kill him. You can also choose not to kill the surrendered Lebedev, in which case Anna will murder him in cold blood, forfeiting your mission bonus pay. Or you can place faith in Paul's words and in the atmosphere and web of lies the game is already weaving around you, and kill Agent Navarro before she can kill Lebedev. Now, I'm aware that this video is getting rather long already, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail over each choice you can make and the effect it has on the game. Rather, I want to discuss a handful of specific decisions, the overarching story, and the final piece of brilliance that truly makes this game shine, in my eyes, above all others. Predictably, JC defects, though he doesn't take an immediate shine to the NSF, preferring instead to strike out against UNATCO's orders and help his brother, whose mysterious kill switch has been activated. When you discover Paul in New York, slowly dying of some unseen force not wholly explained, he asks you to do him one favour. Send out an SOS from a nearby communications tower to a cell called Silhouette in France to warn them of the impending UNATCO attack. Now, this is a choice you cannot diverge from. This is a story beat as opposed to an actual decision made with player agency, and it's important to define the line between the two. This is why my opening dialogue on the game's values specified that it was almost perfect. There are moments where something different could have been attempted, where an entirely new story route could have been crafted for players curious enough to stay true to the patriotic route. But as with all games in the aforementioned 3 categories, there is still a story to tell. That and the fact that we are talking about a 17-year-old game, and CDs back then could only hold so much data. So, once JC has made his choice, you send out the signal and are immediately disowned by UNATCO. Contacted by the mysterious Walton Simons, hitherto only seen 2 or 3 times in the opening sequence, visiting prisoners in UNATCO after the Liberty Island mission, and visiting Jaime Reyes, you are informed that your kill switch has been activated. The clock is ticking. You make your way back to Paul, and it's here that the second most interesting choice takes place, although the game really doesn't tell you that it's a decision to make. When you return to Paul's apartment, your conversation is interrupted by agents at the door. Men in Black agents, specifically, who demand that you step out of the apartment and surrender. Paul urges you to climb out of the window and escape the city. It's a subtle indication of events to come. Simple, but effective. If you take Paul's advice and flee the apartment through the window, Paul will attempt to take on the Men in Black himself. He will not survive. Later, during the escape from the Majestic 12 facility, you will find his body. However, if you instead choose to help him fight, regardless of how successful you are, Paul will survive, and you will find him alive and well in the very same facility. He will then continue to engage with you throughout the game, providing invaluable assistance in the form of moral balancing as the various factions war over one another for control of your choices. And by the way, if you were wondering, no, it is not possible to escape this section without dying. You can make it from the apartment to the streets to the subway, all the way back to Battery Park before you are stopped by Gunther Herman. Depending on your earlier actions, and particularly if Ana Navarra is still alive, Gunther reacts differently. He'll give you an opportunity to give yourself up without a fight, saving time and ammo. Otherwise, he will thoroughly rip you a new one with a plasma rifle. These are the simple but startlingly effective things that make this one of the most lauded games of all time. The further you progress through the game, the more simple, seemingly innocuous little details start to come into play. This is absolutely a game that relies on the player to notice things as much as it does the game presenting them to you. Certain consequences won't become apparent until much later in the game. Perhaps you noticed after escaping the MJ-12 facility that the computers where you can get Ana Navarra's kill phrase, the equivalent of your kill switch that is an instant death for old mechs, will also contain a link to Gunther Herman's kill phrase, but the option is unavailable at the time. So, how do you get it? By telling Jaime Reyes to stay at UNATCO a while longer, obviously. He'll be your inside informant and will later meet you in Paris before your final confrontation with Gunther. He'll give you the kill phrase Le Putain Machine, turning what would have been a lengthy boss fight with Gunther into quite the amusing joke. Also, here's a fun little detail, you can't cheese Gunther before the fight, even if you know where he's standing. He just runs from side to side until you give up. It's kind of hilarious, actually. I'd always thought that the game somewhat loses steam at about the 3/4 mark, but replaying it recently I found that's not really the case at all. The problem actually stems from the fact that I know the first 50 to 60% of the game really well, like the proverbial back of my hand, but I've never quite taken as much time to investigate all the loops and twists and turns present in the latter part of the game. I am intimately familiar with Battery Park, Lower Manhattan and the MJ-12 headquarters, but much less so with Paris, the Catacombs and the Vandenberg sections. And this isn't a failing of the game, these levels are equally as grand in size and scope and packed with secrets, but it falls to me to uncover those secrets. Secrets like the hidden building where you can answer a telephone to hear the AI Icarus mock you, or the hidden panel in Beth Duclair's bedroom, or the hidden room in Morgan Everett's Illuminati compound that takes you to a life support machine containing its former leader, Lucius de Beers. You can never quite shake the feeling that you're being used, and that's why the game's final decision feels so much more impactful than an outside view of it might intimate. After unearthing secrets buried by secrets and uncovering the conspiracies and organisations that are vying for domination of the world governments, you are pushed into delving into Area 51. The game's lead up to its climax is spectacular, gradually having you uncover more and more information about the people you're working with and against, and learning that really there are no right sides, only political grandstanding and the urge for total control gives you an unusually even ground on which to make your final decision. Nothing comes out of nowhere. Everything has a basis, from the Illuminati's desire for you to kill Bob Page and take over the facility, to the AI who wants you to merge with him to create the perfect, benevolent and intelligent leader. You can also choose to destroy the facility, completely obliterating global communications and leading the world into another dark age where chaos and anarchy will no doubt run riot. Each of the endings has its pros and cons, but they all come down to a simple question. Which do you, the player, feel is the lesser evil? JC Denton is very much a blank slate. He has a little personality when he needs to, sure, but in essence he's a projection of the player, caught in a conflict they have no real stake in to begin with. The entire game serves to inform your decision of what to do with the power you are given in the final few moments, and JC is shaped by your choices. He is blank, but sensible enough to justify any decision you make, commenting, for example, "Something just seemed off" if you elect to randomly murder the mechanic in the Illuminati compound without actually knowing or caring that he's a spy. He's the essence of player projection, the drawing board upon which the player sketches their path. And that's perfect. No, seriously, hear me out. That is what JC needed to be, to prevent the character from having persistent conflicts of interest with the player. I am quite happy to concede that this does mean that JC seems a little too eager to jump into conflicts he really shouldn't have anything to do with. But then we'd have no game if you turned around and said, "Nah, I'm good." Of the three endings, I prefer the merger with the AI Helios. We've seen throughout the game how the ideals of Helios have been shaped, and it is an entity born of two other AI who have been built to harbour opposing ideals. One, Daedalus, was created by the Illuminati. The other, Icarus, was built by FEMA. Around 60% of the way through the game, Icarus attempts to overtake Daedalus, and the two of them merge to form a supreme, more enlightened AI, Helios. With true authority over his actions and the wisdom of two sides of the war within him, Helios makes the informed decision to ignore Bob Page's wishes, to merge with Helios himself and gain control of the world, and instead offers the merge to JC. He considers JC an impartial and enlightened human being who will assist in creating the perfect world leader, an empathetic human endowed with the vast knowledge and impartial wisdom of a machine. It's smart, calculated and cool, and it's also the least miserable ending of the three, but that isn't exactly why I like it so much. I like it because it perfectly embodies the transhumanism debates present within the game. It brings a complete end to the circle of humanity, corruption and transcendence that has persisted throughout the game. It feels like the most complete ending to the game, an ending that lives up to its theatrical namesake. The final area is also a smart and grandiose affair with a few factors affected by your previous choices. If you chose to avoid Walton Simons in the deep sea base, he'll show up here instead and engage you in a bit of a one-sided fight unless you have a rocket launcher. If you saved Paul, he will also talk to you via the holographic communicators in your info link, encouraging you to make the choice you feel is right. And if you did not find the mechanic at all suspicious in the Illuminati compound, you can kiss your favourite Black Ops pilot goodbye. Roughly 6,000 words ago, I indicated that I wanted to focus on the second of my three player choice branches. Games where the immediate narrative is affected by player choice but not the ending. No matter how much I wish it was so, Deus Ex absolutely falls into this category. The game's endings are linear, though the final level is anything but. You decide your ending based on a particular set of objectives, and it is entirely possible to change your mind at the absolute last second. If you were to go ahead and disable the power conduits protecting Bob Page but then elect not to push the deactivation switch, you can still turn around and overload the reactor to get the Chaos ending for Tracer, or sabotage the Aquinas router to merge with Helios. The game doesn't push you to go for a specific ending, it just lets you think for yourself. And that is something so desperately needed in video games these days, letting the player think, absorb the information and make an informed decision. Letting the player think for themselves. There are many games out there that trust the player to figure things out and make sensible choices informed by the environment or the characters, the missions or your own morals. The Soul series, Dishonored, Mass Effect. Typically large and dramatic RPGs or careful contemplative sci-fi epics have these kinds of interactive narratives down to a T, and engage the player enough that even if it sometimes feels like you're being shuffled down a straight line of a story, there are pauses for thought and moments of hysterical pondering enough that your choices feel like they matter, even if they ultimately don't. The problem with discussing player choice, and the illusion of choice in gaming, is that ultimately all of your choices are meaningless. Deus Ex accomplishes what few games have managed by drawing the majority of the strings you pull together into neat packages, wrapping up each subplot in an efficient, sensible and enjoyable manner. There are moments where it doesn't always feel like the game knows exactly what it's aiming for. The trudge through the Paris catacombs can be disorienting, and it's frustratingly easy to die horribly to something you could barely see or be struck by overwhelming odds. But really, for a 17-year-old game built in an already defunct engine for the time, with subpar voice acting and an extreme disregard for the trend of simplicity and accessibility in games, Deus Ex is a marvel of narrative interactivity. Let me reiterate something I said now 6,500 words ago. It is said that every time you mention Deus Ex, somebody reinstalls it. They then go on to play the first hour of it, remember why they love it, and stop playing it until the next time someone reminds them about it. I know I'm guilty of that. But that doesn't matter. What is important is the lasting legacy of such an unassumingly ordinary looking game with a distinctly extraordinary ability to suck you in and spit you out. You can't fight ideas with bullets, the game tells you. And that's true, you can't. But you can fight ideas with sincerity and challenge the norm with something truly unusual, refreshing, and vivid. As a work of fiction, Deus Ex stands head and shoulders above its predecessors and its descendants, as a video game with the vision and the drive to change the world, no matter how dated its engine, and no matter how gravelly its protagonist.